"You're worthless, Mom. Dad's new wife isn't." Those were the words my son shouted across a crowded restaurant, while people at nearby tables slowly turned their heads to stare at me. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 68 years old, and until that afternoon I truly believed my son Ryan still respected me. It was a warm Saturday in early spring, one of those gentle days in Ohio when the sun feels soft and the breeze carries the smell of fresh grass. Ryan had texted me 2 days earlier asking if I wanted to have lunch with him downtown. I remember smiling when I read the message because lately he had seemed distant, and I thought maybe this lunch was his way of reconnecting. I even arrived 15 minutes early, the way mothers often do when they're excited to see their children. The restaurant was a cozy little place with brick walls and wooden tables, the kind where families gather after soccer games and couples linger over iced tea. Ryan walked in a few minutes later wearing sunglasses and the same confident stride he'd had since high school. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run toward me after baseball practice, dusty and grinning. We ordered sandwiches and lemonade, and for the first few minutes, everything felt normal. But then Ryan leaned back in his chair and started talking about his father and the woman my ex-husband had married the year before. Her name was Lydia. Ryan spoke about her like she was someone extraordinary, someone impressive, someone who understood life in a way I supposedly never had. At first I thought he was just making conversation, but the tone in his voice slowly changed. The warmth disappeared. His words became sharper. "Lydia knows how to support Dad," he said loudly. "She actually understands what successful people need." I felt a quiet ache begin somewhere deep in my chest, but I stayed calm. I asked him what he meant, hoping maybe I had misunderstood. That was when he suddenly stood up from his chair, his voice rising high enough that the entire restaurant could hear him. "You're worthless, Mom," he said, pointing at me like I was a stranger who had done something embarrassing. "Dad's new wife isn't." The room went silent in a way that only happens when people sense something uncomfortable but can't look away. I noticed a couple at the next table freeze with their forks halfway to their mouths. A young waitress behind the counter pretended to organize menus while glancing over every few seconds. In that moment I realized something painful. My son believed every word he had just said. But what surprised everyone in that restaurant, including Ryan, was what I did next. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked at him with the same calm expression I once used when he was a stubborn teenager. Ryan seemed confused by my silence, almost disappointed that I wasn't giving him the dramatic reaction he expected. "See," he muttered with a shrug. "You can't even defend yourself." Maybe he thought my quiet meant weakness. Maybe he thought the story ended right there, with an embarrassed old woman sitting alone in a restaurant while her son walked away feeling victorious. What Ryan didn't understand that afternoon was something I had learned over many decades of life. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes silence simply means someone is thinking very carefully about what happens next. I remained seated for a few seconds after Ryan finished speaking, listening to the quiet murmur of the restaurant slowly returning as people tried to pretend they had not just witnessed something uncomfortable. My lemonade sat untouched in front of me, the ice beginning to melt under the afternoon sun that filtered through the window beside our table. Ryan looked around briefly, almost as if he expected someone to agree with him, but no one did. A man near the window cleared his throat and returned to his meal, and the waitress carefully walked past us carrying a tray of iced tea as if nothing unusual had happened. Ryan let out a short laugh that sounded more nervous than confident. He dropped back into his chair and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "You see what I mean," he said, lowering his voice, but not enough that nearby tables could not still hear him. "You never change. Lydia actually helps Dad move forward. She supports him. She knows how real life works." I studied my son's face as he spoke. He was 35 years old now, taller than his father, dressed in a tailored shirt that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week when he was growing up. His watch gleamed under the light, and for a moment I wondered if he even remembered the years when I worked double shifts at the pharmacy just to make sure he could join the school science club or travel with his debate team. I remember driving him to early morning practices in my old sedan when the heater barely worked during the Ohio winters. I remembered sitting in the bleachers with a thermos of coffee while the wind cut through my coat. But those memories seemed very far away to him now. Ryan continued talking, almost as if he had been holding these thoughts in for a long time and finally decided to let them out. Dad says Lydia understands business, he added. She knows how to invest money and manage property. You never really did any of that. I folded my hands gently in my lap and listened. There was something strangely peaceful about staying quiet while someone revealed exactly how they saw you. Ryan mistook that peace for weakness. He shook his head and sighed dramatically. Honestly, Mom, you have always been comfortable with being ordinary. The word ordinary hung in the air between us. He spoke it like it was a flaw instead of a simple description. I glanced down at the tablecloth, tracing the faint pattern with my eyes while he continued comparing me to Lydia. According to Ryan, she was confident, organized, impressive. She hosted dinner parties for his father's colleagues and discussed real estate markets like a professional. She apparently understood how successful people lived. Ryan spoke about her as if she had appeared in his life like some kind of guide to a better world. When he finished, he leaned back again and crossed his arms, clearly expecting a response. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally he asked, "Do you have anything to say?" I looked up at him and offered the smallest smile. "Lunch was your idea, Ryan," I said calmly. "I thought you wanted to catch up." That seemed to irritate him even more. He pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor. "You just do not get it," he said. "Dad has moved on. Maybe it is time you did too." A few minutes later he stood up, placed a few bills on the table for his meal, and grabbed his sunglasses. He did not wait for me to respond. He simply walked toward the door with the confident stride he had inherited from his father. The bell above the restaurant entrance chimed quietly as he left. I finished my lemonade slowly and then paid the check before stepping outside into the warm afternoon. Cars rolled by on Main Street, and the air smelled faintly like fresh coffee from the cafe next door. I stood there for a moment thinking about everything Ryan had said and about everything he clearly believed. Then I began walking toward my car, already aware that this was not the end of the story. It was only the moment when the truth finally became clear. I drove home slowly that afternoon with the windows slightly open, letting the soft Ohio breeze move through the car while Ryan's words repeated quietly in my mind. The road from downtown to my neighborhood was only about 4 miles, a route I had taken thousands of times over the years, but that day every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual. I stopped at a red light near the small grocery store where I used to take Ryan when he was a little boy, back when he insisted on pushing the shopping cart even though it was nearly bigger than he was. Those memories felt vivid and close, yet strangely distant at the same time. When the light turned green, the first continued driving and reminded myself of something life had taught me many years ago. When people finally reveal how they see you, it is important to listen carefully. I pulled into the driveway of my small white house just after 2:30 in the afternoon. The house had been quiet ever since Ryan moved out nearly 15 years earlier, but I had grown used to the peaceful routine. My garden sat beside the porch, rows of lavender and rosemary that I tended every morning with a cup of coffee in my hand. That afternoon the sun rested warmly over the yard, and the wind chimes near the front door made a soft sound as I stepped inside. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water before sitting down at the small wooden table by the window. The same table where Ryan used to do his homework while I cooked dinner after long shifts at the pharmacy. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember those years clearly. When Ryan was 12, his father had already begun traveling more often for work, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. I became the one who helped with science projects, who attended school meetings, who stayed awake late balancing bills while Ryan slept upstairs. There were winters when the heating bill climbed higher than expected, and I quietly picked up extra hours at the pharmacy to keep everything steady. Ryan never knew how carefully every dollar was planned back then. I never wanted him to feel that kind of pressure. My phone buzzed lightly on the table, pulling me back to the present. A message notification appeared on the screen. For a brief second, I wondered if Ryan might have sent an apology, perhaps realizing that he had spoken too harshly in the restaurant. But the message was not from him. It was from an unfamiliar number. The text was short and polite. "Hello, Mrs. Carter. This is Michael Grayson from Grayson and Whitmore Legal Services. We spoke briefly several months ago regarding a family matter. Please call our office when you have a moment." I looked at the message quietly, reading it twice. Michael Grayson was the attorney who had contacted me earlier that year after my former husband finalized certain financial arrangements following his second marriage. At the time, the conversation had seemed routine, nothing urgent, just paperwork and clarifications. But something about the timing of this message now felt unusual. I set the phone down and walked to the living room where a small bookshelf stood against the wall. On the middle shelf sat a simple photo frame. In the picture, Ryan was about 8 years old, wearing a red baseball cap that was slightly too big for his head while he held a trophy from a weekend tournament. I remembered how proud he had been that day. He had run across the field waving the trophy like it was the greatest prize in the world. I stood there for a long moment studying the photograph and thinking about the young boy who once believed his mother could solve any problem. Eventually, I returned to the kitchen and picked up the phone again. I knew that whatever Michael Grayson needed to discuss probably had nothing to do with the uncomfortable lunch earlier that day. And yet a quiet feeling in my chest told me that this phone call might be the beginning of something Ryan never expected. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment longer, looking at the message from Michael Grayson while the quiet afternoon light slowly shifted across the floor. Outside the window, a neighbor pushed a lawnmower across his yard, and somewhere down the street a dog barked lazily. The kind of ordinary sounds that usually make a day feel peaceful. Yet something about that message carried a different kind of weight. I picked up the phone and dialed the number carefully, placing it on speaker while I rested my hands on the table. After 2 rings, a calm, professional voice answered. The man introduced himself exactly the way the message had said. Michael Grayson from Grayson and Whitmore Legal Services. His tone was polite and steady. The voice of someone who had spent many years explaining complicated matters to people who were not expecting them. I told him this was Helen Carter returning his message, and for a brief moment, there was a quiet pause on the line, as if he were gathering his thoughts. Then he thanked me for calling and explained that he wanted to confirm a few details regarding documents that had been finalized several months earlier after my former husband remarried. I remembered that meeting clearly now. It had taken place in a modest office building about 15 miles outside town on a rainy Tuesday morning. At the time, my former husband had already moved into a larger house with Lydia on the northern side of the city, and his financial advisors had recommended updating certain legal arrangements connected to property and long-term planning. When Michael Grayson mentioned those documents again that afternoon, his voice remained calm but precise. He explained that a recent review had required a final verification from me regarding several signatures and beneficiary designations that had been filed earlier in the year. I listened quietly while he spoke, occasionally glancing toward the small photograph of Ryan still sitting on the bookshelf in the living room. The attorney continued explaining that the documents involved assets my former husband had accumulated over many years, including investment accounts and a property agreement that had existed long before his second marriage. None of this sounded unusual at first. Financial matters often required periodic updates, and I assumed the call was simply routine confirmation. Yet as Michael Grayson continued speaking, he carefully mentioned one detail that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. According to the documents that had been filed months earlier, certain long-standing provisions had remained exactly as they were originally written, even after my former husband married Lydia. The attorney explained that these provisions would become relevant under specific circumstances related to estate planning and long-term distribution of property. He did not speak dramatically or suggest anything urgent, but I could hear the careful emphasis in the way he chose his words. When he finished explaining the technical details, he asked if I would be available later in the week to stop by the office so that everything could be reviewed in person and officially finalized. I agreed without hesitation. The office was only about 20 minutes from my house, and I had no reason to refuse. After the call ended, I remained seated at the table for a while, staring out the window at the quiet street where the afternoon sun had begun to fade slightly behind a line of tall maple trees. Ryan's voice from the restaurant still echoed somewhere in my memory. The certainty in the way he had praised Lydia. The confidence in the way he had dismissed me as someone ordinary. I wondered if he truly believed that his father's new life had erased everything that existed before it. Slowly I stood up and carried my empty glass to the sink, rinsing it while I thought about the upcoming meeting with the attorney. Sometimes life changes in loud, dramatic moments that everyone can see. Other times it shifts quietly through small conversations and overlooked details that only reveal their importance later. As I dried my hands with a kitchen towel, I had the unmistakable feeling that the quiet phone call I had just received would soon become far more important than Ryan could possibly imagine. I slept lightly that night, waking once around 3 in the morning when the house had that deep stillness that only exists before dawn. For a few minutes, I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hall and the faint rustling of wind moving through the maple trees outside my bedroom window. Normally, when I woke during the night, my mind wandered through small, everyday worries like grocery lists or the condition of my garden after a storm. But that night my thoughts kept returning to the calm voice of Michael Grayson and the careful way he had spoken about those documents. Eventually I got up, made a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at the kitchen table where a soft yellow lamp lit the room. There was no anxiety in what I felt, only curiosity and a strange sense that something long settled in the past was quietly shifting. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cool spring air. I watered the lavender along the edge of the porch the way I always did and watched a pair of sparrows hop across the grass looking for seeds. Life in my neighborhood moved at its usual slow pace. A school bus passed around 8:15 and Mrs. Dalton from 2 houses down waved as she walked her golden retriever along the sidewalk. For a while the events at the restaurant almost felt distant, like something that had happened weeks ago instead of just the day before. Around mid-morning, I opened the small desk in my living room where I kept personal documents and letters. Inside the drawer sat several neatly labeled folders that I had organized over the years. Tax records, insurance policies, old photographs, and a thin blue folder marked property agreement. I had not opened that particular folder in months, but I remembered placing it there after my last meeting with the attorney. I carried it back to the kitchen table and gently spread the papers across the surface. The documents described arrangements that had been created decades earlier when Ryan was still a young boy and my former husband and I were planning the future we believed our family would share. Over the years, certain details had been updated, but some of the most important provisions had remained exactly the same. That was the part Michael Grayson had carefully mentioned on the phone. As I reviewed the pages slowly, memories returned of long conversations from the past, when life had looked very different. Back then, my former husband had always believed in preparing for the future with careful planning. He used to say that stability came from decisions made long before they were ever needed. I remembered signing the papers with him during a quiet afternoon meeting at a small legal office downtown many years ago, while Ryan waited outside in the lobby reading a comic book. At the time, none of it felt dramatic or important. It was simply responsible planning for a family that expected to stay together. Of course, life rarely unfolds exactly the way people imagine. Marriages change. Children grow up. New people enter the picture. Yet some decisions remain preserved in ink long after circumstances shift. Around noon, I closed the folder and placed the documents back into the drawer, feeling a quiet clarity settle over my thoughts. In 2 days, I would visit Michael Grayson's office again to finalize the review he had mentioned. The meeting itself would likely be straightforward, just signatures and confirmations, nothing that would attract much attention. But as I stood by the window watching clouds drift slowly across the bright spring sky, I could not ignore the quiet realization forming in my mind. Ryan believed that Lydia had changed everything about his father's life. He believed that the past had been replaced by a more impressive future. What my son did not yet understand was that some decisions made many years ago had never been erased at all, and when the time came for those decisions to matter, they would tell a story very different from the one Ryan seemed so certain about. 2 days later, I woke before my alarm, the soft gray light of early morning stretching across the bedroom ceiling. The air felt cool and quiet, the kind of calm that arrives just before the town begins to move. I dressed slowly and made a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, then stood by the kitchen window watching the street outside my house come to life. A delivery truck rolled past, followed by a woman jogging with headphones, and somewhere down the block a garage door opened with a familiar mechanical hum. My appointment with Michael Grayson was scheduled for 10:30 that morning, which meant I had plenty of time to drive the 20-minute route to his office on the north side of the city. I left the house a little after 9:45, carrying a small folder with the documents he had asked me to bring. The drive was peaceful, the sky bright, and clear above the wide Ohio roads. As I passed the downtown district, I noticed the same restaurant where Ryan and I had eaten lunch earlier that week. For a brief moment, I considered stopping to buy coffee, But instead I continued driving, letting the memory drift quietly behind me like a scene from another chapter. Michael Grayson's office building stood near a row of tall glass structures where several financial firms operated. It was not an intimidating place, just a clean professional building with a small fountain near the entrance and neatly trimmed hedges lining the walkway. I parked in the visitor section and stepped inside, where cool air and the faint scent of polished wood greeted me. The receptionist recognized my name immediately and asked me to take a seat while she informed Mr. Grayson that I had arrived. A few minutes later, the attorney himself appeared from the hallway with the same composed expression I remembered from our previous meeting. He shook my hand politely and guided me into his office where sunlight filtered through large windows overlooking the parking lot below. The room contained tall shelves of organized binders and a wide wooden desk where several folders had already been prepared. Michael Grayson invited me to sit and began reviewing the documents one by one with the steady patience of someone who believed every detail deserved careful explanation. He spoke about financial structures that had been established many years ago and updated gradually as circumstances changed. Some involved retirement accounts. Others involved property agreements connected to investments that my former husband had made long before his second marriage. As the conversation continued, Michael paused at one particular document and turned it toward me. His voice remained calm, but slightly more deliberate than before. He explained that this document had been originally signed decades earlier when Ryan was still a child, and that its core provisions had never been altered. According to the agreement, several assets were structured to follow a predetermined path that could not easily be redirected without very specific legal steps. My former husband had reviewed the arrangement several times over the years, but had chosen to leave it exactly as it was. Michael looked at me carefully to be certain I understood what he was describing. I nodded slowly, remembering the afternoon long ago when those papers had first been signed while Ryan waited. In the lobby flipping through a comic book. Back then none of us had imagined the family would one day be divided into separate lives and new marriages. Yet the document had remained unchanged through all those years. After explaining the details, Michael asked me to confirm a few signatures and initial several pages verifying that the records remained accurate. The process took less than 20 minutes. When we finished, he placed the folder neatly back on his desk and gave a small professional smile. I thanked him for taking the time to review everything so carefully. As I stood to leave his office, a quiet thought crossed my mind. Ryan believed that Lydia had reshaped his father's entire future. He believed the past had quietly disappeared behind new promises and new plans. What my son had never considered was that some decisions made decades earlier were still waiting patiently in the background, unchanged and perfectly intact, ready to speak for themselves when the right moment finally arrived. When I stepped out of Michael Grayson's office that late morning, the sunlight felt brighter than before, reflecting off the glass buildings that lined the street. I walked slowly across the parking lot, holding my purse close to my side while a soft breeze moved through the trees near the sidewalk. Nothing dramatic had happened in that office. There were no raised voices, no shocking revelations spoken out loud. Just a calm review of documents and quiet confirmations written neatly on paper. Yet as I reached my car and opened the driver's door, I understood something very clearly. Life had a way of unfolding through patience rather than noise. I drove home along the same familiar route, passing small shops and intersections that had been part of my daily routine for years. The afternoon traffic was light, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, the clock on the dashboard read a little after 11:45. My house looked exactly as it always did, white siding, a small porch, and the lavender plants swaying gently along the walkway. I stepped inside and placed the folder from the meeting back in the desk drawer where it belonged. Then I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat down at the kitchen table, thinking about the conversation I had just had with the attorney. Ryan's voice echoed again in my memory. From the restaurant a few days earlier. The certainty in the way he praised Lydia. The confidence in the way he believed she had brought wisdom and order into his father's life. I did not feel angry about those words anymore. What I felt instead was a quiet understanding that Ryan had built his opinions on a story he only partially knew. People often assume that the newest chapter of a story is the most important one, but they forget that the earlier pages still exist. I looked around the kitchen slowly, remembering how many years this house had been filled with the ordinary sounds of family life. Ryan running down the stairs for school. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. The small arguments about homework and curfews that seemed so important back then. Those memories had never been erased simply because time had moved forward. They were part of the foundation that shaped everything that came after. Around 1 in the afternoon, my phone rested quietly on the table beside me. I stared at it for a moment before picking it up. For several seconds, my thumb hovered over Ryan's contact name. The last conversation between us had ended with him walking out of that restaurant convinced that his words had settled the matter. I wondered if he had thought about that moment afterward, or if he had simply continued with his life without another thought. Finally, I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear while it rang. After the third ring, Ryan answered with a distracted tone, the sound of traffic faint in the background, as if he were walking somewhere outside. When he recognized my voice, he sounded slightly surprised, but not unfriendly. I told him I hoped his week had been going well, and that I wanted to invite him over to the house for dinner the following evening. There was a brief pause on the line before he responded. He sounded curious, perhaps wondering why I would reach out so calmly after the way our last meeting had ended. I simply explained that sometimes it was better to talk in a quiet place rather than a crowded restaurant. Ryan hesitated for another moment before agreeing. He said he could stop by around 6:30 after work. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and took a slow sip of my iced tea. The afternoon sunlight moved gently across the kitchen floor as the minutes passed. Ryan believed that our lunch earlier that week had been the final word in our conversation. What he did not realize was that some conversations are only beginning when people think they are already finished. I spent most of the next day preparing a simple dinner the way I used to when Ryan still lived at home. Not because the meal needed to be impressive, but because routines have a way of steadying the mind. By late afternoon, the kitchen smelled faintly of roasted chicken and herbs, and the sunlight coming through the window had turned warm and golden as it moved across the wooden floor. Around 6:15, I set 2 plates on the table along with glasses of iced tea and a small basket of bread. The house felt quiet, but not tense. It felt the way a place feels when something important is about to be spoken calmly rather than argued loudly. At exactly 6:28, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. A moment later, Ryan's footsteps crossed the porch and the doorbell rang once. I walked to the door and opened it with the same calm expression I had carried since our lunch earlier that week. Ryan stood there wearing a navy blue jacket and holding his car keys in one hand. He looked slightly uncertain, as if he had been expecting something different from the tone of my phone call. For a second, we simply looked at each other before he stepped inside. The kitchen lights reflected softly against the counter as he glanced around the house, taking in the familiar furniture and photographs that had not changed in years. "Smells good," he said, sounding a little cautious. I thanked him and invited him to sit down. For the first few minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. His work schedule, the traffic downtown, the unusually warm weather that week. The conversation felt polite but slightly distant, like two people trying to remember how they used to talk before something uncomfortable had happened. Eventually, Ryan leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the table. His expression shifted into the same confident look he had worn in the restaurant. "So," he said, "what did you want to talk about?" I took a slow sip of iced tea before answering. "I wanted us to have a quieter conversation than the one we had at lunch," I said calmly. Ryan nodded once, though his posture suggested he still believed he had already said everything that mattered. "Look," he replied after a moment, "I might have been a little blunt the other day, but what I said was not wrong. Dad is doing well. Lydia has helped him organize things. She understands how to handle his finances and investments." He spoke Lydia's name with the same admiration I had heard earlier in the week. I listened without interrupting. Ryan continued, explaining how his father's life seemed more structured now, how Lydia had introduced him to new advisors and helped manage properties that I supposedly never paid much attention to years ago. When he finished, he looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. Instead of arguing, I simply reached across the table and slid a small envelope toward him. Ryan looked down at it with a puzzled expression. "What is this?" he asked. "Just something you should read," I replied. Inside the envelope were copies of the documents Michael Grayson and I had reviewed earlier that week. Ryan opened it slowly and pulled out the papers, scanning the first page with mild curiosity that gradually shifted into concentration. The kitchen remained completely quiet except for the faint rustle of paper as he continued reading. His eyes moved more slowly across the lines, and the confident expression he had been wearing began to fade. "Where did you get this?" he asked finally, his voice no longer as certain as before. I rested my hands lightly on the table and answered in the same calm tone I had used all evening. "From the attorney who helped your father and me organize our financial plans many years ago," I said. Ryan looked down at the pages again, reading more carefully now. The room stayed silent as the meaning of the document slowly unfolded in front of him. For the first time since he arrived, my son seemed unsure about the story he had believed so confidently just a few days earlier. Ryan continued reading the pages slowly, his eyes moving back and forth across the legal language as if he wanted to be absolutely certain he understood what he was seeing. The confidence he carried into the house earlier had completely disappeared now, replaced by a quiet concentration that made the room feel even more still. After a long moment, he looked up at me with an expression that was no longer defensive but uncertain. "This says these accounts were structured years ago," he said carefully, "before Dad married Lydia." I nodded once and folded my hands together on the table. "That is correct," I replied calmly. Ryan lowered his eyes back to the document again. The papers described financial arrangements and property provisions that had been placed in a legal structure long before his father's second marriage ever happened. They had been reviewed several times over the years, but the core design had remained untouched. The attorney had explained it clearly in his office earlier that week. Some decisions, once placed into the proper legal structure, follow the path they were originally given unless someone goes through a very specific process to change them. Ryan read another page, then another, his brow slowly tightening as the details connected in his mind. "So Lydia does not control any of this?" he asked quietly. I answered with the same steady tone I had used throughout the evening. "Your father manages his life the way he chooses," I said. "But certain arrangements were made a long time ago to protect the future of the family that existed back then." Ryan leaned back slightly in his chair, the papers still in his hands. The kitchen light reflected across the table while the evening sky outside the window slowly turned darker. For several seconds he said nothing at all. I could almost see the moment when his understanding shifted. The story he had built in his mind about Lydia guiding everything, about the past being replaced by something new and more impressive, no longer fit with what he was reading. Finally he looked at me again, this time with a different expression entirely. "Why did you not tell me this before?" he asked. I gave a small thoughtful smile and reached for my glass of iced tea. "Because sometimes people only hear the truth when they are ready to question their assumptions," I said gently. Ryan stared at the document one more time before placing the pages carefully back inside the envelope. The confident certainty he had shown at the restaurant was gone now. In its place was a quieter understanding that life was often more complex than the simple stories people tell themselves. The room remained peaceful, the smell of the dinner still lingering softly in the air. After a while Ryan cleared his throat and looked around the kitchen as if noticing the familiar room in a new way. "I should not have spoken to you like that at lunch," he said slowly. The apology sounded sincere, though it carried the awkward weight of someone realizing his mistake later than he should have. I did not answer right away. Instead I glanced toward the old photograph of him on the shelf across the room, the one where he stood proudly holding a small baseball trophy from years ago. "We all say things we regret when we believe we understand more than we actually do," I replied quietly. Ryan nodded once, absorbing the words. Outside the window, the last light of the day faded behind the trees while the kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. That evening ended without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. It ended with a calm silence between a mother and her son who had finally begun to see the full picture. And as Ryan prepared to leave later that night, I knew he would remember something far more important than the documents he had just read. He would remember that respect, once forgotten, often returns through the quiet lessons life delivers when people least expect them.